Without further ado, we would like to pass the floor to Dr. Farouk Musa, moderation of the panel this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Brother Mustafa, my panelists, Dr. Rizwan Khushari, Brother Wansaful, and Dr. Mustafa Kamal Kianwa. And I'd like to welcome all of you again to our evening session, which to me is basically the crux of today's meeting. Basically, we had done, especially Dr. Ashraf, I think he took almost 2 years to complete the translation, and we took a few months to edit the work. And we had done very thorough editing, and perhaps I would say, I'm not trying to say they were good, but basically there is not a single sentence in the book that would not make sense to you, right? Like some translated books, you have problems in understanding what they're trying to say because the translations tend to be literal, but our translation is not literal translation, and that's why we use the word Berhujah untuk Kebebasan, a Muslim case for liberty, which is the English translation. Muslim case for liberty, we translated it as Berhujah untuk Kebebasan. It's not a literal translation, but it gives the idea about liberty, about what Brother Mustafa wanted to explain to all of us. To start this session, I would like to just express to you about my feelings when I first read this book. When I first read Mustafa Agyul's book, I said to myself, I have wanted to write this kind of book by me, by myself, because I wanted to share my thoughts and my ideas about the problem that we are facing nowadays, the Muslim community. I started IRF in, it was officiated by Professor Tariq Ramadan in 12th December 2009, but I actually formed it in 2007. At that time, I was still working in Australia. The reason why was basically, as you had seen, if you can see in the tagline, our tagline is لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for people who think. Basically, it's this lack of rationalism, of rational thinking that is, to me, according to my hypothesis, is current problem that what we're facing among the Muslims, especially in this country. We tend to look back at everything in our worldly matters back to the secondary source, which is not primary source, which is the Quran, but the secondary source, which is Hadith. And the problem is that you try to understand everything through the scope of the 7th century Muslims, right? And Mustafa Agyul started this book very well when he explained about the problems of this 21st century actually started a long time ago. That was during the battle of the people of tradition, or what is known nowadays as the Ahlus-Sunnah or Ashairah, against the people of reason. That's the Mu'tazilah. So people might accuse us of being neo-Mu'tazilites. We wouldn't mind. Actually, we took it as a compliment. And we think that there's a need to rejuvenate the Muslims' thinking, right? And to basically to understand that worldly matters must be solved using our rational thinking, using our intellectual faculty. I've always quoted in many of my writings that the main reason why God had basically asked the angels to prostrate to Adam when he created Adam was simply because of one thing, that is the rational faculty or the intellectual faculty that Adam possesses, right? وَعَلَّمَ الْآدَمَ أَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. And we have imparted unto Adam the name of all things. Asma akullaha, the name of all things. Literally, people say is a name of, this is mountain, this is, if you understand it literally. But actually, according to Muhammad Asad, the Quran that IRF is basically translating, and we have translated almost 20 juzuk out of 30 juzuk. of course with the help of some of my friends, colleagues, including Brother Osman. He explained that this asma kullaha, name of all things, so basically conceptual thinking, the ability to think conceptually, that is basically the only faculty that's been given to human and not to any other sentinel beings, not even to the angels, because the angels only follow whatever God orders, except of course the devil, right? But that's the thing, and that is what is lacking in Muslim nowadays, right? There is the fear to think, because this fear is being, to me, it was being inculcated by the powers that be or the ulama, right? By saying that you cannot use your brain to think in matters of religion because you'll be following the devil. That's the sayings in Malay, right? You have heard this. All the ulama pondoks, this is like their ratib, their zikir, that you cannot use your intellectual faculty. It's the zikir. You must follow and obey. What we say is true, is true. What you say is halal, halal. What we say is haram, is haram. So that is the problem that we are facing nowadays. So we do not have modern solution to modern problems. We cannot come up with modern solution to modern problems. We are still looking at the this voluminous of books of hadith and trying to find answers in there. And that's the problem with us, right? We're scared to think. Whereas when the Quran asks us to think, it's us, invoke us to think, but we are scared to think. And I think Brother Mustafa started this book very, very well about this problem that we're facing nowadays. And with that, I think I invite Brother Mustafa to deliver his speech. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Sorry, my Bahasa is very poor. I just learned how to say good morning, but I couldn't do good afternoon yet, so I'm saying it in English. And thank you, really thank you, IRF, Brother Musa, Noor, who's I'm very happy to meet, just, we'll talk later, who meticulously translated the book. And for everybody in the world, including a lot of people in this room, trying to open up minds in our Muslim world. Why I wrote a book like this? I'm not going to tell you everything in the book. I mean, you should buy and read it, probably. it's a better way of sharing the thoughts. But I'll say a few ideas. I'll try to share a few ideas in the book to give a sense of what I'm arguing here. But even before that, let me tell you why I got interested in this issue of freedom in the name of Islam. There's a story in the beginning of the book I tell about me, my grandfather's library, a book I found there, but I'm not going to tell you that. You can read it in the book. I'll tell you another story. It was, I think, maybe 10 years ago. I was in Boston, the U.S. city of Boston, and for a conference. And I went to the train station. I think I was coming from New York. I took the train. From train station, I took a taxi to the hotel. And I got into the taxi and I saw the driver and his name was written Muhammad something. So obviously a Muslim name. I said, "Oh, assalamu alaikum, brother. Like, how are you? Kayfa hal? Like, what's up?" Like, I tried to do the Muslim connection. It happens in taxis a lot in the US because drivers can be potentially Muslim. Then I realized the guy really was not happy is me saying salamu alaikum to him. And the more we talk, I realized that he actually is not a Muslim anymore. He said, "I've abandoned that faith." And he said really nasty stuff actually about Islam, about the Prophet, about... And I said, okay, I respect your point of view, but can I ask, like, what's the background? Like, what happened? Like, of course you have a right to, think differently, but the more I learned, I realized that he was from Iran, and here, with all the respect to our Iranian or friends or people from the region, and as I understand, his father was from somewhere in the Shah bureaucracy. So after the revolution, his father was jailed, rightly or wrongly, and he suffered heavily in jail, and I think ultimately he was killed. So, and he was telling me how these Muslims, ummas came and did this, ulamas, mullahs and all of that. I realized he was angry at a political system, actually, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Cumhuri Islami, as I understand. And then it was an eye-opener for me because I realized, when you have a state in the name of Islam, acting in the name of Islam, and that state somehow does wrong things, oppresses people, because states do a lot of supposedly liberal states do too. The anger against the regime turns against anger against the religion. And I'm sure we can find a lot of examples in the Saudi case, in other. Right now, there is a much worse case, which is what? The so-called Islamic State in the middle of Iraq and Syria, which is doing the most horrific, barbaric things and saying this is the Islamic State. I mean, what can be worse for Islam than having an actual, tyrannical reality and acting in the name of Islam? That was one of the many experiences which led me to think, okay, we should rethink this issue of Islam, freedom, states, authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. And by the way, I'm reading the Quran since I'm very regularly, since I'm, 16 years old probably. In the Quran, I never heard a term like an Islamic State. I never heard a term like caliphate. Actually, there's the word caliphate in the Quran, but it is not a political institution. It's actually God's viceroy on earth. We are all caliphs. We are all representatives of, because we carry God's spirit. He created us. So we have that kind of authority. And so in that sense, Quran, the term in the Quran only exists in that sense. I never heard the term religion police, which is very important in Saudi Arabia in the Quran. So there are a lot of things in the Muslim world that's going on, which I did not see in the Quran. So I started this intellectual journey, if you will, to think, and it went on for a long time. I mean, I wrote the book in 2 years, but behind that there's a lot of thinking and experiences and reading and research and so on and so forth. One more thing though, when I saw all these authoritarian regimes acting in the name of Islam with different varying degrees, I also saw something else. In the same region, the Middle East, let's say, there are other authoritarian regimes which are not Islamic, actually which are not very big fans of Islam, actually secular authoritarian regimes as well. I've seen this very clearly in Turkey, the old Turkey, now we call it. There was the ban on the hijab, headscarf, and I was a big, passionate warrior against the ban on the hijab, and I was saying women can be able to decide what they will wear. And I had to make that argument in Iran or Saudi Arabia against the Islamic State. And in Turkey, I had to make that argument against this illiberal secular state, which thought that the state should tell women what to wear. And I realized by those experiences that this authoritarianism problem is not coming from Islam. It is a problem. It's a universal problem. I mean, you have North Korea too, the most authoritarian probably entity on earth. It is a universal problem. It's coming from power. It's coming from authoritarian structure. It's coming from patriarchal culture. It's been there since the beginning. Just maybe we have the problem of Islam being interpreted by people, by regimes that happen to be authoritarian. So when they look a verse in the Quran and when they see alcohol is haram, what they understand is that we should ban it and we should punish and flog everybody who drinks alcohol. Whereas the Quran just says haram, which is telling Muslims not to stay away from it as a moral obligation. So they've turned every moral obligation into a very strict rule, in the history of Islamic fiqh. So in that sense, my book goes to the very beginning, look at the Quran, the prophetic message, the prophetic sunnah, the experience, and tries to see there what actually we can learn today to develop a more liberal Muslim point of view. One thing I underline is the role of the individual in Islam. The term individual is not appreciated that much by some of our Islamic thinkers and regimes. They say Islam is a communitarian religion. Individuals don't have much importance. Individualism is a Western creation. By the way, individualism in the West developed within a Christian perspective too. That's an interesting thing to note here. But because it grew out of the person's relationship with God, with the individuals. Well, in that sense, I looked at Islamic tradition, especially the Quran itself. What does the Quran tell us about the individual? Well, it's a long story, but I'll just tell you one thing. Islam actually brought the idea of the individual to a very communitarian Middle East, pre-Islamic pagan Arab society. What do I mean by that? We all probably know the term Jahiliyyah, right? The age of ignorance. What was the problem with Jahiliyyah? They were worshipping idols, right? They were pagans, they were idolaters. So that was one major problem. But there's another aspect of Jahiliyyah we generally forget. Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance before Islam for Arabs, was a very tribal society. In pre-Islamic Arabia, if you did not belong to a tribe, you didn't have any value. Your value as a human being, they change according to the tribe. Is it a powerful tribe? Is it a weak tribe? According to that. And when, for example, tribes had wars and conflicts, if somebody killed somebody from this tribe, the other tribe would give just somebody as a retribution, anybody. The individual didn't matter. The crime was not personal. And when the tribe needed men and there were too many women, you know, they could kill female babies, infanticide. We see this in the Quran, how the Quran condemned infanticide and secured the life of those young babies that were killed by some pagan Arabs. With Islam, before that, why the Arabs were so tribal? Because they were living in the desert. In the desert, you can't survive without a tribe. You can be an individual hanging out and reading poems and just going around. I mean, you have to have some allegiance. But they didn't have a law, an idea of rule of law, which would come later by Sharia. They also did not have the individual as someone who will live even after his death. Because according to Islam, the individual never dies, actually. We die, but we go on. We are resurrected, we go to afterlife. And we never disappear. The individual is created by that, goes till eternity. For the Arabs, the tribes were going for thousands of years. The individual was just an unimportant little thing in the dust of the desert. Islam said no, every individual counts. Every individual has a right to life. Every individual will go to afterlife and God will judge the individual based on his moral deeds. So the idea of individual having a personality was actually brought into the pre-Islamic pagan Arabia by Islam. And there are Western scholars who acknowledge that and saying that Islam actually brought the idea of the individual rights. So that is something we should also always keep in mind. And we should also keep in mind that since we are individuals who are responsible to God ultimately on religious matters, we are not responsible to states or mullahs or imams, or we can learn from them and we can live under states as a citizen with certain rights and regulations. But states did not create us. Who created us is God, and we are ultimately responsible to God. That moral being is, I think, a very important thing. Is every religion like that? Well, not necessarily. Well, with all due respect, for example, Catholicism has the idea of priest acting as a mediator between you and the God. You go and confess your sins to the priest. So the church is a very important institution. It has its blessings maybe, but Islam is different. In Islam, you're just responsible. You don't talk to anybody. You don't say your sins to anybody else. It's between you and God. And there's the idea that the world is a place of test. God is testing us. He has given us life. And at the end of this test, we will go to heaven or hell, depending on what kind of person we are. So in order to be able to give that test, we should be able to have freedom. We should be able to choose between right and wrong, between sin and the righteous behavior. So because of that. So that's one, I think, important wisdom we can find within Islam. This is one thing. Another thing, which is actually a very toxic word, Sharia, right? Today, the people who say we are implementing Sharia or we want Sharia, they generally scare a lot of people, even sometimes us, right? Because they want to do a lot of authoritarian things, chop off heads, whatever. I mean, the Sharia mongering people are generally not very lovable and not very liberal generally in these days. But the problem with that, as I argue in the book, is their literalist understanding of the Sharia. Whereas if you look at the Sharia in terms of its intentions, a whole different picture emerges. Now, what do I mean by literalism and intentions of Sharia? I'll give you an example. This time not from Iran, but from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has actually much more problems than Iran when it comes to religion and authoritarianism. Maybe, is there anybody from Saudi Arabia here? Do we have any friend from Saudi Arabia? No? Okay. Maybe you've heard in Saudi Arabia there are a lot of bans. One of them is that women cannot drive cars. So you're female, you can't drive a car. It is very interesting because actually it's not in the Sharia, women can drive cars everywhere. In Malaysia they drive, in Turkey they drive. How well they drive is disputed by some Turkish men, but that's it, misogyny. But it's free, you can drive. And in Saudi Arabia, they have this ban. I've discussed this with a lot of Saudi scholars. Now, in a few settings I've discussed. They say, well, we have to protect them in the homes, and blah, blah. And they say, Prophet Muhammad said so. And you say, like, what Prophet Muhammad said so about driving cars exactly? They will quote a hadith which literally reads, quote, do not send women alone to the desert. End of quote. Do not send women alone to the desert. So they shouldn't be able to drive in the desert, which Saudi Arabia is whole desert, so they shouldn't be driving around. Now, I discussed the meaning of this hadith and the Islamic lesson from that with a Turkish professor, actually head of the Diyanet, the official institution in Turkey now, the religious institution, Professor Mehmet Görmez. He said, Prophet Muhammad probably said so because at that time between Mecca and Medina there were bandits in the desert. They were attacking every unprotected caravan. And just a few women walking by themselves in the desert would be prey to these people. So he's just something about that particular event. And if you want to take a lesson from that today, you can say we need safe cities, safe highways and so on and so forth, which is a universal value, right? But no, if you say Prophet said so, so literally it means this today, so we can. So that is the problem, one example of problem with literalism. And today, a lot of the problems we're having with the Sharia imposing systems or regimes or Sharia promoting people is that they are actually understanding it in very literalist terms, which sometimes goes against the intention, the original intention. Here's another example, which is, I know it's also a bit controversial in Malaysia too, and I respect Malaysia's laws and cultures, and I'm not going to advise against that. But on a theoretical level, I'm discussing this matter of apostasy, changing your religion. And if you're Muslim, can you become a Christian? And can you say, I was a Muslim, but I became a Christian, I became a Buddhist, I became an atheist? Can you say that? And can you be safe? Well, if you look at the Quran, of course. Let there be no compulsion in religion. The truth is from your Lord. Let anyone who wants to believe it, believe it. Let anyone who wants to disbelieve it, disbelieve it. There are many verses in the Quran which says religion is a matter of free choice. And it doesn't make sense, actually, the other way around, because if somebody doesn't believe in Islam anymore, what can you do? I mean, if you say, no, you can't convert to Islam, what can you achieve? He can best become an hypocrite, right? But in the Sharia, apostasy is not allowed. It's considered as a crime, as a capital crime, and the punishment is death penalty. So if a Muslim comes out and says, I'm not a Muslim anymore, he can go to the court and he can be given death penalty. And this happens. It happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Sudan. There was a controversy in Iran, but the guy was ultimately let go, a man named Yusuf Nadar Khani. In Iran, another man named Abdurrahman, if I'm not wrong. It's in the book, actually. But there are several cases of converts into other religions, often Christianity, because you don't convert to Judaism, generally. I mean, you are born Jewish, but Christianity is like Islam, a universal religion. So this is an important issue, right? If you're going to speak of Islam, freedom, human rights, human rightism, and not because I'm a human rightist, but I'm a Quranist, I see a problem in this. And that's why there's a chapter about this issue in my book, which shows it is not the ban on apostasy in Sharia does exist in classical schools of thought, both in Sunni and Shia. But when you look at deeper, you see something interesting. The scholars, all these scholars, Imam Shafi, Hanafi, Hanbal, Jafar, all who living in the 8th, 9th century living at a time that Muslims were generally at war with some other empire, the Byzantines, the Sassanids, and there was constant war. In their mind, apostasy meant Muslims, a group of Muslims, leaving the Muslim army and going and joining the enemy army. It was high treason, as we would call it today. That is why in the Hanafi school of thought, which is generally more flexible in the Sunni tradition, Hanafi said apostates should be killed if they're males. Females don't count. This was not misogyny of the Turkish drivers. This was just a simple recognition that women are not soldiers in medieval warfare. So for them, apostate was a problem because he could join the enemy. He could be. Now, if you look at today, no army would tolerate joining the enemy in the course of battle. So yeah, if you put it as high treason, every country has laws about that in that sense. So when we understand the intention of the whole apostasy ban, you say, okay, it made sense in that context, but today, changing your religion is a matter of conscience. It doesn't mean high treason to an army. So we should be okay about this. We wouldn't want to see fellow Muslims changing their religion. We can talk to them, we can try to persuade them, but we shouldn't kill them. As Christians are not killing Christians who become Muslim. And we would be really very unhappy if we saw that. So here is one example of looking at Sharia from a literalist point of view versus a intentions, understanding the purpose. And actually this whole idea of looking at the intentions, the goals of Sharia, is right there in our Islamic tradition. Imam Shatibi, living in North Africa in the 14th century, he wrote a very valuable book, Maqasid al-Sharia, the intentions of Sharia, the goals. And he researched all the injunctions, and he said the whole Sharia is about protecting 5 principles, 5 values. Protection of life, every life counts. Protection of religion, protection of intellect, protection of lineage, whose father is who, and protection of property rights, which bring us to market theories of Van Saiful, very important. So if these are so you need a system basically which will protect your life, which will protect your religion in the sense of giving you every right to practice your religion, which will protect your intellect, which will protect your property. Now, where do you achieve these? Do you achieve these in Sisi's Egypt, or do you achieve these in Syria, Iraq, God forbid? You can have these values in Canada probably pretty well, or I don't know, in any liberal democratic rule of law kind of Sweden country. So if you look at the intentions of Sharia, the whole picture changes. So we can find those intentions somewhere else. And from Sharia, we can go to those intentions. So this is one way of understanding, I think, Islamic law today. And if we understand that way, Islamic law actually becomes a liberal principle, protecting rights from authoritarian governments. And in the book, I actually showed examples of how sometimes Sharia protected the humans, the individuals, from the sultans, authoritarian governments, with its authority. In Islamic tradition, for example, we have a tradition of waqf, foundations. Why foundations existed and no sultan could ever go and confiscate it? Because governments like to confiscate things. They try to take a lot of taxes and so on. Because they were protected by Sharia. No waqf, no foundation, charitable foundation was ever confiscated legally, because in Islamic law it is untouchable. Because the Sharia was about the sultan. Sharia was about the state. It was not the order of the ruler. It was an order on the ruler. So if you look at that, Sharia becomes like a natural law as we understand in the liberal tradition, a general universal concept of rights that we should protect from whomever, from terrorists, from governments, from whomever can violate our rights. Now you can say at this point, Mustafa, you are a nice guy and you have some nice ideas, but are you a heretic? Are you totally speaking nonsense and just speaking to liberal-minded Muslims, and are these ideas totally bizarre and out of the Islamic tradition? I say no. Check my chapter on the Ottoman Empire, which is a good chapter, one of the good chapters. There I show the Ottoman Empire, the very seat of the caliphate. dealt with these issues in the 19th century in the Tanzimat reforms. The Ottomans abandoned the ban on apostasy. In late Ottoman Empire, it became possible to declare you an atheist. There were atheist thinkers in late Ottoman Empire. And Ottoman thinkers wrote very good books against them, refuting their theories. Their presence allowed an intellectual vitality in that sense. The Ottoman Empire made Christians and Jews full equal citizens of the empire. The whole idea of dhimmi, protected, that was a historical category. The Ottomans gave them full citizenship. That's something you cannot convince still some people today in the Middle East and maybe in some other countries. The Ottoman Empire gave full rights to women. I mean, the whole idea of inheritance, marriage, they were all reformed. And Ottoman scholars did this by basically thinking within the Hanafi tradition, which said, as times change, laws should change. So the social aspects of Islam is open to reinterpret it. Did everybody like these reforms? No. There were some revolts against the Ottoman Empire. There was an important revolt in the middle of the 19th century in Hijaz. The forerunners of what we call Wahhabism today, there was revolted against the empire, and they said Turks are changing Sharia, they have become infidels. One of the things they were angry at was that the Ottomans banned slave trade. And they said, slave trade isn't Sharia. Well, slavery is certainly not in the intentions of Sharia, but you can find slavery written because Islam organized this institution. It was a historical category. So with the Ottoman example in mind, today we can look a bit more flexible on all these issues. And today there are already, modern world today, there are scholars like Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia who would accept a lot of ideas I'm sharing here today. In Iran there have been prominent Ayatollahs. Ayatollah Montazeri had very important issues. He said apostasy is not a matter of changing religion, it's about a matter of warfare, so people should be able to change their religion. So there are kind of these liberal-leaning voices within Islamic tradition by referring to the classical sources. Then how they will be more popular, how we will have this more relaxed, more lenient, more tolerant understanding of Islam, an Islam that appreciates, well, we will work, because there's no pope in Islam, as we all know. There's no central authority who will say this is it. In every society we have to work. We have a battle of ideas ahead. We have to convince other Muslims, and we have to inform ourselves. And it's a long task, I'll tell you. I mean, Christianity changed in many centuries, and now it's a faster time. There are a lot of communication. And one more thing, the West's challenge towards us, on us, actually makes us more defensive sometimes and makes us move forward. I've seen a lot of, for example, Muslims who say, when you speak about women's equality, they will say, this is a Western idea, and that imperialist West, which bombed Iraq, and da-da-da-da. Yes, but we're not doing this for the sake of the West. We're doing this for our own women. We need to give them the rights they deserve, not to make somebody happy. So we should understand that fundamental thing, and we should, I think, re-understand our religion to be true to its founding principles, and not to be lost in the technicalities, the literal texts of written 10 centuries ago with good intentions, but maybe also fit for that context, but which doesn't make sense today. So that is one of the key messages in my book. There are many other good stuff in there, so you can maybe check that. But I'm really, really thankful to IRF for making this book available in Malay. And thanks for your time and sharing your time here today. Thank you.